Should you flex your spine when lifting, or should you keep it straight? There are compelling arguments on both sides, so which is right or wrong? In this video, we're going to break down what both sides are saying. We're going to look at their strengths, their limitations, and also we're going to look at what's consistent between both sides of the argument. And then at the end, we're going to look at what we can do practically with this information to be able to understand lifting much better. So without further ado, let's get into it. A quick preface before we get started. This video isn't to prove one way or the other. What it's there to do is help you understand how scientific information works and how to put it into practice, because it's not as simple. You should never do this and you should always do that. There is more nuance, there is more context to it, so we have to understand it from that perspective and actually put the information into a context and make sense of it. So what does the science say? Now, everything that I'm using in this video is referenced below. So what's written is the information, and then it's referenced below. So from a paper, or a systematic review as it's called, it's quite a long title, so I'm just going to use the start of it. So it's to flex or not to flex. So this paper is saying that there is no effect whether the spine is bent or whether the spine is straight. And they're basically saying there's no difference between lumbar spine flexion and what is known as a neutral spine on lower back pain. So on that side of the argument, that apparently there is no difference. Then what we have on the other side is another paper done by Adams and Dolan. This was done in 2012. It's known as intervertebral disc degeneration, evidence for distinct phenotypes. And the conclusion of that is they found lumbar flexion puts compressive forces on the anterior part of the disc, or the front part of the disc. And this can accelerate degeneration. Now, degeneration is seen as it happens with aging, but what we can say is that there are physical changes on one side, and on the other side it doesn't matter. So how do we consolidate and reconcile these two bits of information? One saying that spine flexion does have an effect because there are physical changes, and the other side saying there is no difference between the two. You can bend your spine and lift, and you can keep your spine straight and also lift. So this is an apparent contradiction that we need to make sense of. So what we're going to do next is look at both the strengths and the weaknesses, or the strength and the limitation of both of these sort of bits of information. Now, what's referenced below, I think, is about 5 different papers, so it's not just this information. I'm just pulling out little bits of information that are within what I've written in the notes below. So without further ado, let's get into strength and limitations. If you're confused about lower back pain, maybe what you're trying isn't working. Maybe one influencer is telling you to do one thing, and then another influencer is telling you to do the complete opposite. Who do you believe? Well, in this, your education is key, because the more you know, the more you can weed out wrong information and right information. So in order to do this, I've put together the fundamentals of health and fitness membership. So this is an evolving membership, and it's at christopherholetraining.com. So you can click that in the description below. What we've got in there is, first of all, it's the simple science in a monthly newsletter. So this will be built out of topics that I'm talking about, questions that are being asked within the members area. There are short courses, tutorials, around low back pain, core strength, endurance, posture, longevity. We also look at how to assess all of these topics. So how can we put in measurements and markers to show that we're making progress and getting where we want to get. There are step-by-step exercise workshops, so you can learn how to do exercises properly, you can learn how to progress them, make them easier, you can learn the common faults that people make and how to correct them. And then finally, there are follow-along workouts on the topics of core strength, core endurance, posture, strength, longevity, and everything else. So if you're interested in getting healthier, getting fitter, and at least getting to a place where you can make sense of information, then click the link in the description. So what are some strengths of both sides of the argument? Well, if we take the flex or not to flex paper, what we've got here is a good aggregated estimate of scientific literature, let's call it that, to give it the technical name. What it basically says is it's giving you a good overview of information out there. So that paper shows 12 studies. All of the studies use objective measurements, because the measurements of spine flexion are all done via sensors. So it's much more objective. It's not just relying on self-reporting. There's a greater degree of accuracy there. On the side of spine flexion having an effect on lower back pain, it shows evidence of structural changes. So it's not just we can't feel pain. We may not be able to feel pain, but we can see that there are structural changes underneath being pain-free, if that makes sense. Because what most people will use is well, I'm not feeling pain, therefore I'm okay. But if we can see structural changes, then we can start to make sense of what's working and what's not working. Then we can move on to some limitations. So if we take the side of spine flexion has no effect at all. So these studies involved low loads. So what they don't do is they don't show it doesn't reflect any effects of heavier lifting or higher exposure to heavier lifting as well. So where they're showing a good broad overview and they're using sensors to measure the degree of spine flexion, what they're not doing is they're not showing heavy lifting, which in a gym generally is heavy lifting. And as I've mentioned, if there's no pain, generally people feel that it's okay. On the side where spine flexion has an effect, what they haven't done is, they've shown that there is variability in defining what is flexion. Some say 45 degrees, some say 30 degrees. So at what point are the changes occurring? So what we can now start to see is, there are flaws in the side of spine flexion has an effect on lower back pain, but there are also flaws on the side of spine flexion doesn't have an effect on lower back pain. So we can start to see the context, because on the side of spine flexion, they've only used low loads. So what happens at high loads? They aren't describing that. And with regards to spine flexion, what is spine flexion? Is it 45 degrees? Is it 30 degrees? What are we saying here? So we have to understand these different parts of the context before we talk about them, because again, as a professional, we have to have a greater understanding. And this is something that, if you've watched any of my videos before, that I've tried to highlight. There is more to it than what most people are saying. When most people just talk about spine flexion, they just say it's okay at all weights. Whereas some science doesn't even show the difference between what happens at low weight and what happens at high weight. So we have to take it for that context, and we have to be defining what is spine flexion. Otherwise, some people will say it's spine flexion is this, but some other people will say it's that. And we can't have a proper discussion if we're not talking from the same perspective, if that makes sense. What's consistent between both sides of the argument? So in literature or in papers or in studies, what you will generally find is that as we've talked about, there are limitations to studies, which we've talked about. But what you can also start to find, if you read both sides, is you'll read that there will be information that is consistent, and this is what we need to try and pull out of the studies, of the reviews. Number one, evidence quality is low to moderate due to small sample sizes. So if we look at all of the amounts of people used, I think in the flex or not to flex, I think the most is like 170 people in one study. I think that's right. It might be 120. So again, it's not massive numbers with regards to how many people they're looking at. So where across studies it maybe builds up to 700, 800, something like that. Again, on the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge amount of people. The second thing is spine flexion alone isn't the predictor, which is why I keep saying there is more to it than just spine flexion. We have to take into consideration the load being lifted, the frequency at which the load is being lifted, be it a light load or a heavy load. We have to take into consideration the amount of exposure they get to it. Is it happening every day? Is it happening once a month? Also the duration of it. Are they lifting 8 hours a day? Are they constantly bending and re-straightening all day? Or is it just for 5 minutes? So all of that has to come into it. And this is what both sides are saying, is that we can't just look at spine flexion. We have to look at all these different factors. And that's why some people say it's multifactorial, but we have to understand what the multiple factors are. And there are some of them there: load, frequency, duration, exposure. So all of this has to come into what we are thinking about. Both sides also acknowledge that pain can change movement and movement can change pain. So when we talk about, I think it's in the to flex or not to flex, they make the statement that people with pain changed how they lifted. So that's going to influence the results, and that's going to influence how people lift, is whether they're in pain or whether they're not in pain. So most people out of pain, certainly if it's a light load, will flex the spine and probably be more happy doing it. So you can start to see, with regards to scientific literature, it's limited because we're only looking at certain factors. It's very difficult to assess multiple factors because there are so many caveats that come along with all of that. There's a biomechanical effect. So obviously Adams and Dolan, they reported flexion increases disc strain. And in another paper by Steffens in 2019, they acknowledged this as well. So they were on the side of spine flexion has no effect, but they did acknowledge that there were changes occurring, if you will. And finally, there are different rules for there are different movement rules for different populations. So that's something that, again, we need to take into consideration, are these different rules. So again, if you've watched any of my videos before, I'll say it's not as simple as lift that weight off the floor with a neutral spine or lift it with a flexed spine. We have to look at that context. We have to look at, are you exercising in a gym? Are you working in a factory? Are you working in a warehouse? Do you sit at a desk? All of that has to come into it. So for you in your specific scenario, that's what you, or this is what you need to do, and you and a different person in a different scenario, this is what you need to do. You have to understand your own pain as well. But before we get into that, and I suppose that leads me nicely into it, is how do we apply this practically? So the first thing anyone has to do is start educating themselves on information like this. Understand both sides of the argument. Be able to reconcile what we've done in here is try to reconcile some sort of information. Okay, so what are both sides saying? And hopefully we've highlighted 4 or 5 parts of that. Once we've started educating ourselves on the information, then we can start digging into, right, what is my pain? What is my low back pain? So we have to go through some sort of assessment process. And that is what's within the members area. There are low back pain assessments where we assess the spine, where we assess the hips, the core. What else do we assess? The muscle trigger points that could be affecting it. So again, what we're trying to do is look at multiple factors. There are questionnaires in there that go through and talk to you about your pain. What is your pain? Again, the purpose of the assessment and the questionnaires within the members area is not necessarily to diagnose your pain. It's there to educate you about pain, about your pain, and which is why I also put together is how to interpret what does all this mean. And then what should start to happen is a pattern should unfold in your pain and in your low back pain. And then what you should be able to do then is make at least some degree of calculated assessment as to, well, it seems like this is my problem. Well, it seems like this is what I may need to do about it. Again, what's in there isn't all the answers. Just like this video isn't here, I'm not trying to prove one side or prove the other. What I'm trying to do is help you understand that there's more to it than don't flex your spine or do flex your spine when you lift. Whenever I'm working with people, I'm constantly assessing. I take them through an initial assessment, initial questionnaires, but then as I work with people, I need to constantly look at how is this changing over time? What are the exercises that are affecting them in a positive way and in a negative way? How can I modify those exercises? So we start to see it's not always such a simple answer. We need to go through some sort of assessment to get there. What we can then start to do is then start looking at, once we've got some idea of what our back pain is telling us, we can then use, for example, the exercise workshops to go, well, okay, let's look at the deadlift, which is how I'm lifting. Okay, well, let's look at how the deadlift is supposed to be performed with the teaching points. Let's then think about, well, my pain is telling me this, and the teaching points are telling me that. Okay, well, how can I adapt the deadlift to make it work for me? Do I need to lift the weights off the floor? Do I need to not bend the knees as much? Do I need to bend the knees a little bit more? Do I need to keep my body up a little bit straighter when I lift? Things like that. We need to start thinking about exercise, because this is essentially what I do in the gym with people, is everything is on the table, but we have to make sense of I have to make sense of what I'm working with. So what's in the members area is, I guess, me, but online. I'm trying to get everything that in here that I'm using with people and put it online. Not necessarily to make you believe what I'm saying, but to give you more information so you can make a better decision. So once we've started adapting the workshops, then we can start understanding, okay, this is the type of exercises that I need to be doing, these are the types of workouts I need to be doing, so on and so forth. Which is why the members area has the short courses for the education, the assessment in there, so we can start having a better understanding of low back pain as a whole, but also for a specific individual. If you're a professional watching this, assessments are in there, example tests are in there, how to interpret it's all in there, so you can learn it for people that you're working with. Then you've got the exercise workshop. So once you've got an understanding of how everything works, you can think, well, okay, I need to modify it in this way, or I need to modify it in that way. And then obviously the workouts are there if people want to go through and do them. So that, I guess, is how you would practically put it all together. There is no one answer. I can't say, well, because of this science, it means you need to do a deadlift that way, or because of this science, you need to do it this way, or this is the only way to do it. It all depends on the individual's pain, on the amount of exposure they have, on the duration that they're doing it for, so on and so forth. Those multiple factors that we talked about. So let's wrap up. Scientific information needs to be kept in its proper context. So with regards to flex or not to flex, it was only light weights. So we can only read that paper from the perspective of they're using light weights. So if people are talking about heavy weights and lifting, we might not use that information because it doesn't highlight that, if that makes sense. We need to start thinking differently about how we consume information. So obviously I work with people professionally with lower back pain, building their health, building their fitness, building their strength, building their longevity, so on and so forth. I'm always thinking critically. I'm trying to keep as many factors in my head as possible, and I need to think, what is the best for this individual based on everything that I know. Because again, I can't know all the science, I can only know all the science that I've read. And it's the same for you. So based on what you know, what is the best decision you can make? Don't just go believing an influencer over one influencer over another. So if you want to learn more, click the link in the description, come through to christopherhulltraining.com, get into the membership and start learning and start making better decisions. If you've got questions, there are comments below that come directly through to me and I'll be able to answer them. They are public comments, so it's not only for your benefit, it's for the community's benefit as well. But I'll be obviously waiting for those comments to come in and I'll be answering them as best of my ability. So many thanks for watching. Hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully it's given you a better idea of should you flex your spine or should you not flex your spine. And hopefully it's given you a few more questions to go and learn a little bit more. So many thanks for watching. My name's Chris. I'll speak to you in the next tutorial.